So in this lecture, we're looking at something that's very close to me, environmental biology. And if you find this lecture interesting, I do teach another course in this, Biology 104, which is all on environmental biology, where we would go into all of these issues I bring up in this lecture in a lot more detail, plus a lot of other issues. So yeah, if you're interested, you could look up that other class. So for the news, there was an article that came out last year, and this is called a meta study or meta-analysis. And what they were doing is they were collecting a bunch of other papers and kind of synthesizing information and data from those other papers. And this paper was very thorough. It looked at more than 10,000 papers on climate change, and particularly papers that looked at the response of animals and the evolution of traits in response to changing temperatures. And what they found in this meta-analysis was that for most of the species that had been studied so far, they could not adapt fast enough to survive if, temperature changes as fast as it's predicted to. So like on this graph here on the left, this is showing the difference between how much the temperature is thought to change versus how much the species can deal with that change. So for a number of species where their response is below zero, what that's telling you is that they will not be able to keep up with changing temperatures. So in this lecture, we're going to first look at resources, so the difference between non-renewable and renewable resources. And we're going to take a brief survey through a lot of the resources that we depend upon: wood, food, fresh water, energy. And then on the subject of energy, we'll also have a discussion on global warming. Then we'll talk about extinctions, and lastly, a little bit on human population. And there's the textbook chapters that deal with kind of environmental science type of information. So humans as a species and also as an industrialized agricultural society, we depend a lot on different resources to survive. And commonly these resources are divided into renewable resources and non-renewable resources. So there's a little bit of a misnomer here. So technically all resources we depend upon are actually renewable, but some of them renew very slowly, on the order of millions of years, like coal, petroleum, natural gas, precious stones. Like these resources do renew on a geological timescale, but on our timescale they don't. So you can basically treat them as a finite quantity. So that's what non-renewable resources are, is that there are resources that renew so slowly, on the order of millions of years, that you basically can treat it as if it doesn't renew. And even for renewable resources would be those that renew on a time scale that for us would appear that there's always going to be a source of supply of this resource. Like fresh water, timber. There are processes on our lifetime scale where these resources will renew themselves. But even for these renewable resources, humans can extract these resources faster than they are naturally replenished. And in that case, their usage is said to be unsustainable. So for the big question in this lecture is, for the resources that human civilization, industrialized civilization, needs to function, are we using these resources at a sustainable rate, basically at or below the level at which they're renewing? And if it's sustainable, then that means we can basically keep using these resources indefinitely. Or are we using these resources at an unsustainable rate? And that means that we will eventually run out of them, because we're using them at a higher rate than their replenishing rate. So eventually, these resources will go down to zero, even though they are renewable. So let's take a look at some of the resources we depend upon, starting with wood. Wood and timber represents an important resource. It's a renewable resource. The way that wood replenishes itself is by the reproduction of woody trees. So when woody trees, create seeds and disperse and grow into new woody trees, that's how this resource replenishes itself. We use this resource for a lot of different functions, especially construction of buildings, furniture, and creating paper. And it's also a really important source of heating. So about 3 billion people, or 40% of the world's population, they burn wood every day for heating their homes and for cooking. And on the lower left here, you can see a nice diagram that, the wood industry, forestry industry put out, kind of showing you all of the different resources, all the different ingredients and stuff that are derived from woody trees. So demand for wood products has increased steadily over the years. Right now, wood trade accounts for about 7% of the total world economy, or the gross world product. And what's caused this rise in demand for wood has been population increases, and also technological innovation has made it easier for us to cut down wood very quickly. So as you can see on the left, this is a diagram showing you total paper production has been increasing steadily in this graph since the 60s, including recycled paper. For a while when people started creating computers, there was this idea that, well, maybe with computers we'll use less paper because all these documents will just be on the computer. We won't have to write stuff down. But actually the use of paper has continued to rise alongside computers, because now people will regularly, print stuff out. Overall wood production has been increasing. Industrial uses of wood has kind of stabilized since the 90s, but fuel wood has been continuing to increase around the world. So the big question with regards to wood and forestry is, are we using these resources sustainably? And so far we have not. So we have been cutting down wood much faster than the rate at which wood replenishes itself. In fact, over the last 120 years, we've lost about half of all forest land on the earth. 8 million square kilometers of forest. In this picture here, you can see this is the original forest cover as you would have seen, maybe 3,000 years ago. And then on this lower diagram here, this is forest cover as it appeared in 2005. So you can see in a lot of parts of the world, Africa, throughout Europe, Asia, Australia, South America, North America, everywhere, forests have been cut down at an unsustainable rate. We've been cutting down forests faster than they replenish. So the current rate of loss every year is that the net loss of forests is 130,000 square kilometers a year, which is the size of Louisiana. So every year we're losing that much space, that state size amount of forest around the world. At the current rate of deforestation, we're going to be completely out of forest land in about 123 years. You can see that deforestation has risen alongside population. So as population has been increasing, that's this kind of yellow graph here, there's also been a rise in deforestation around the world. So now let's shift to another topic, which is food. If you look at human history kind of on a global scale, so since humans have been kind of living as humans, the vast majority of that time, humans have been living as hunter-gatherers. In fact, there still are hunter-gatherer societies alive today. But nowadays, the majority of people consume food as part of agriculture. So they are part of this global industrialized agricultural society. And civilized humans have temporarily boosted the productivity of agricultural land through the use of specific processes, pesticide use, the use of fertilizers, and irrigation. And The spread of these tools around the world, that was referred to as the Green Revolution. And that drastically boosted productivity, how much food people could create on a unit of land. But the problem is that this boost is temporary. So these same practices which increase productivity in the short term tend to decrease productivity in the long term. You get the erosion of soil, buildup of salts to toxic levels, which is called salinization, etc. So the land becomes degraded over time through the use of intensive agriculture. In fact, from 1960 until today, about 1/3 of the world's arable land, which is land suitable for agriculture, has been made unusable because of these intensive agricultural practices, and that's according to the World Wildlife Fund. And right now, 40% of the world's landmass is already used for agriculture, for the growing of crops or for grazing of domesticated animals. And that's including all landmass. So that includes Antarctica, that includes the Himalayas, that includes the deserts. So a huge amount of the landmass of the world is already used. And in many regions of the world, most of the land that could potentially be used for agriculture is already used for that function. So there are not these huge available areas that are fertile that have not yet been turned to agricultural use. So because agriculture is unsustainable, it degrades land. Every year we lose more and more land, and agricultural land, which was fertile, transitions into desert, and this is called desertification. And every year about 10 million hectares of agricultural land is lost to desertification. That's equivalent to 1/4 of the land area of California. So all around the world, land is being lost to this process because it's being degraded. And so what goes on here, why land becomes desert, is the processes of adding lots and lots of fertilizer and irrigating and the use of pesticide. All of these processes cause the upper layer of soil, the topsoil, to be degraded, to wear away. And topsoil is the most productive type of soil. So as this top layer of the ground gets eroded away, the land becomes far less fertile. It's much more difficult to grow any crops there. We're currently losing topsoil around the world at a rate 40 times greater than the rate at which it naturally replenishes. And you can see on the map here, this is a map showing you the extent of soil degradation around the world. This isn't an issue where rich countries are doing this right and poor countries are doing this wrong, or Europe is doing this right and other countries are getting it wrong. Everywhere around the world, you can see very degraded soil is red and yellow is degraded soil. So everyone is getting this wrong. Agriculture, as it's practiced everywhere in the world, is getting this wrong. It's diminishing topsoil. Land is becoming unproductive over the long term. So scientists estimate that at the rate of loss of topsoil, it will be completely used up and land productivity will collapse in about 60 years. And based on studies that we know, they've done experiments on like how much crops can you grow on land that's been degraded like this, that doesn't have topsoil, and productivity really does go down. You're unable to produce the same amount of crops that you did before. Humans are also losing the war on crop pests. We're using 33 times more pesticides now compared to how much we used in the 1940s. And back then we lost about 31% of crops to pests, and today we lose about 37% of crops. So even though we are dumping, tons and tons and tons of poisons onto our crops, it is not actually effective in the long term. And The reason why we are losing this battle is because those species that we are targeting, that we are trying to use poisons on, these pest species are really good at evolving. We're talking about, weedy plants, insects, rodents, fungi, bacteria. All of these groups tend to evolve very, very quickly. So as soon as we start to use poisons, these pest species will evolve resistance to those poisons. And this is a graph here, it's just shown for weedy plants. But as you can see here, like let's take one of these graphs here. This is one class of herbicides used against plants, ALS inhibitors. You don't have to know specifically what that means, but just that people developed this type of poison, it looks like around the 1980s. But you can see that by the year 2000, you had almost 100 different species of weedy plants that were resistant to this poison, that the poison no longer worked on them. And this is true for other toxins as well. So these triazines-based poisons introduced in the 70s, but by 1990 you had 60 or so different species of weedy plants that were completely resistant to it. And this doesn't just happen with weedy plants. Insects also evolve resistance. Rodents evolve resistance to poisons. So every time we intensively use these types of pesticides, these species pretty quickly respond by evolving resistance. So we've talked about agriculture, the creation of food on land. So now let's look at another important source of nutrition, which is fish. And worldwide, fish proteins account for about 15% of all total protein consumption. So this is a very important food source, especially for people that live close to the ocean. And similar to the situation with wood, similar to the unsustainability of agriculture, there has just been too many boats taking too much fish from the ocean. And this is also true for freshwater systems as well. And overall, fish are being taken from the ocean about 3 times faster than they naturally replenish those populations by reproduction. At the current rate, scientists think that all of the world's fish populations currently used for food are expected to collapse from overfishing by 2048. So even fisheries that people generally regard as these are sustainable, they are not. They are still being used at a faster rate than the populations can support. So they are slowly diminishing and will eventually collapse. So part of this has to do with technology, that technological innovations have just made it so much more efficient to bring in massive amounts of fish compared to traditional techniques of gathering fish. So there's been innovations like fish finders, which use sonar to find all of the patches of fish, which make it very difficult to have any reserves of fish that can help replenish the population. The development of giant trawling nets that just drag along the bottom of the ocean, taking everything in its path, including sometimes, sea turtles and dolphins by mistake. And also just having faster boats that can travel long distances. So all of these combined have meant that fish populations get depleted much faster than they would have in the past based on traditional methods. And just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, let's look at a couple videos. On the left here we have Cambodian spearfishing. So let's see the efficiency of this fishing method. So even if he stays out there for a few hours and is pretty good at the spearfishing technique, he'll have a hard time bringing more than just a handful of fish back to his village. And let's see the modern, technologically advanced version of fishing. So that's an example of one of those giant trawling nets I mentioned before. And in a matter of minutes, they could bring in, tons of fish onto a fishing boat. So to kind of show you how serious this has been, several major fisheries have already collapsed due to overfishing. So Atlantic cod, what used to represent a very important world fishery and a really common source of food, it collapsed nearly to extinction in 1992 due to overfishing. And this graph here that you have on the right is very characteristic of what you'll see in all of the graphs I'm going to show you. So I want you to show you a little bit of what this means. On the x-axis, we have time. These are different years divided up by decades. And on the y-axis, this is fish landings in tons. This is basically how much fish fishermen brought in over the course of a year. So it's in tons. So starting off here in the 1850s and 60s, it would be like, maybe 150,000 tons of fish brought in over a year. And what you can see is that the total amount of fish brought in each year was steadily rising, but kind of at a slow rate. But then once you get into the 1960s and 1970s, suddenly you bring in a lot more fish. You bring in almost, up to a little bit more than 800,000 tons of fish in a year. And so at this point, the population of Atlantic cod was really starting to collapse. There was just way too much fish brought in. In the following years, it's not like fishermen said, okay, we got to back off here. They still went out with the same amount of effort or even more effort and all of the fishing vessels and tried to catch Atlantic cod as best they could. So basically, they very efficiently depleted the survivors, the few codfish that were left, until in 1992, the population dropped to practically zero and has not recovered and is still not recovered as a real fishery anymore. This same story is played out over and over and over again around the world. Here's an example from a freshwater system. This is Lake Ontario, and there was overfishing of a number of different lake species, including blue pickerel, herring, and trout. You can see all of these, the number of landings, the number of fish brought in millions of pounds. It increased up until the mid 1900s, until the populations collapsed, and is still at very low levels today and has not recovered. And this doesn't just happen with fish. This also happens with invertebrate species that are used as a food source. So this is showing you scallops, exploitation of scallops off the coast of Brazil. As you can see, this is the tons of scallops brought in, increased a lot up until 1981. And then in 1982, people basically tried very hard to still bring in those scallops. So they basically killed off almost all of the survivors off the coast of Brazil until after 1982, practically zero scallops were caught and still not recovered today. This also happened around the world with several different species of sardines. So sardines, this is showing you, again, total landings, the total amount of sardines, of different species of sardines. You can see there was a slow rise for some of these species, but at a relatively low level going into the 1950s and 1960s. But then in the 1980s and 1990s, you suddenly get, a lot more sardines brought in. In 1985, for this particular species, um, 12 million tons of sardines were brought in. And you can see the same pattern for these other species down here. So really an overexploitation, way too many fish were brought in the 80s and 90s, and this caused the populations to collapse. And you can see they still remain at very low levels today. So these populations have not recovered from this exploitation. So we've talked a lot about the situation with food, which is basically that agriculture and fisheries both are not sustainable right now. Let's turn to another resource to see how that situation is. Another necessary resource for us is fresh water. And fresh water is required for a lot of functions. Individual use, like in the home, manufacturing, industry, the creation of electricity using fossil fuels, all of these require a lot of water. But the biggest user of water around the world is agriculture. In fact, between 80 and 90% of all freshwater use is specifically for agriculture. And around the world, water has been used at a greater rate than it replenishes into clean fresh water. So a lot of areas of the world already suffer from intense freshwater pollution, from agricultural runoff, from sewage getting into water systems. So more than 3 million people die every year from water pollution related diseases. And as you can see in this map here, a lot of the world deals with water scarcity, with not having enough access to clean fresh water. So areas that are in red or in kind of orange yellow, all of those have either physical water scarcity, that they just don't have the water available to them, or economic water scarcity where they can't afford access to clean fresh water. So fresh water takes many different forms, including surface water, which is kind of the most visible to us, lakes and rivers, but also underground systems of rivers, which are called aquifers. And a lot of aquifers are being drained much faster than they can replenish, which means eventually they will run out. So on the map here of the continental United States, you can see all of those blobs represent different aquifer systems. So some of them are quite large, and they are color coded. So blobs that are in kind of bluish or greenish are being used sustainably. So you can see there's a couple there in the north that are being used sustainably. These ones on the eastern coast are being used roughly sustainably. But aquifers that are red or orange or yellow are being used unsustainably. So they're being depleted faster than they are replenished, which means eventually too much water will be pulled out of those aquifers and they'll be depleted. There will not be any more clean fresh water in those systems. If you take, for example, this large red splotch in the middle of the United States, that's called the Ogallala Aquifer. And that's really important for agriculture. In fact, about 30% of all irrigation for agriculture comes from that one aquifer. And as you can see, it is in red, so it's being used unsustainably. In fact, it's being used about 4 times faster than the rate at which it replenishes. And in the last decade, the water levels dropped by 3%. It's hard to know exactly how much water is in there, so it's difficult to predict how much time we have that we can use that aquifer, but we do know that at the current rate, we are going to be running out of those aquifers. Okay, so now let's turn to another important resource that supports us, which is energy. And although we pay a lot of attention to alternative forms of energy, they get a lot of attention, we are still highly, highly reliant on fossil fuels. So about 80% of the world's energy still is in the form of fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are energy-rich remnants of ancient dead organisms. They are literally fossilized remains of life from millions of years ago that have become really dense and carbon-rich and can be burned as an energy source. They primarily are remnants of plankton and plants. And there's different forms of fossil fuels that I'm going to talk about. So what I did is I made this calculation. I looked at the data from the United States government, from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, of how much of these different types of fossil fuels are known or thought to exist on the planet, what's the current rate of our use of those fossil fuels, and then based on those numbers, how much time do we have until we will exhaust the global supplies of these fossil fuels. So you can make these calculations too, but all of this data comes from that U.S. agency. So yeah, we're going to look at these types of fossil fuels: coal, petroleum, and methane, or natural gas. So according to the estimates of coal usage and world supply, and this includes how much coal is known to exist as well as how much coal is thought to exist, coal reserves should run out in about 125 years. So that's the situation with coal. If we look at petroleum, petroleum supplies based on how much petroleum is thought to exist and the current rate of usage, supply should run out in approximately 47 years. Natural gas supplies will run out, kind of similar to petroleum, in about 60 years. So keep in mind that fossil fuel usage is not stable, has not been going down, but actually has been increasing pretty quickly. In fact, it increased worldwide 25% between 2000 and 2008, and will likely continue to increase in the future. So these supplies will probably run out sooner than the estimates that I gave here, because that was based on if usage remained at the current level. There are other sources of energy that exist, renewable sources. Some of them are renewable, like solar, wind. Nuclear is not renewable, but it is considered an alternative energy source. However, it's not clear that these other sources of energy can provide enough to support civilization after fossil fuels run out. So for example, nuclear power is not renewable. It requires a finite resource, which is radioactive uranium, which will eventually run out. And if we switched entirely to nuclear, would run out in a few decades. Wind energy causes relatively few problems compared to fossil fuels, but it only really works in areas with frequent high wind. So it may not be an energy source that we could upscale to create enough electricity for the world's demands. Solar energy requires a lot of resources to produce, including some very rare metals in its current form. And if the installation of solar panels involves deforestation, as it sometimes has in rainforests when they've cleared rainforest land away to make way for solar panels, then at that point solar panels is a big contributor to global warming. Besides the fact that fossil fuels are rapidly running out, another problem associated with fossil fuels is their impact on global warming. And global warming, sometimes called climate change, although I prefer global warming, is the slow warming of the Earth, so an increase in the average temperature of the surface of the Earth. And the Earth is currently warming due to an enhancement of what's called the atmospheric greenhouse effect. So the atmosphere operates a lot like a greenhouse. And so let's see how a greenhouse actually functions. And another example of a greenhouse effect that you'll encounter in your daily lives is with a car. So if you've ever gone into a car, the inside of a car is often much hotter than the outside. And this is because of the greenhouse effect. So in your car, and this is also true for a greenhouse, visible light passes really readily through glass. That's why glass appears to be transparent because it allows visible light through. So you have visible light coming in, it gets absorbed and reflected by objects as infrared radiation. Infrared radiation is another wavelength of light. It's different than visible light. So it turns out that although glass is transparent to visible light, it is not transparent to infrared light. It reflects infrared light. So all of this infrared light that's created in the car, based on the absorption and reflection of the energy that comes in, this infrared light gets trapped. It bounces off of the glass and gets trapped inside the car or inside the greenhouse. And so this causes the inside of that structure to warm up further. And that's why your car is so hot, is because that glass is holding in all that infrared light. So it turns out that our atmosphere works in much the same way. So most of the light that passes through our atmosphere from the sun is visible light. There's a little bit of UV radiation that goes through and some wavelengths of radio waves, but primarily visible light passes through our atmosphere. And this light gets absorbed and reflected, including as infrared radiation. So you get infrared radiation kind of emitted from the surface of the Earth. And so as this infrared radiation heads up into the atmosphere, if there are certain gases present, they absorb this radiation and release it back to the surface. So they trap the infrared light against the surface of the Earth. And so because they are doing this, because they have the function of allowing visible light through, but reflecting infrared light against the Earth, these gases are referred to as greenhouse gases because they are creating a greenhouse effect in the Earth's atmosphere. So examples of these greenhouse gases would be carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, nitrous oxide. And what people mostly pay attention to as far as greenhouse gases go are carbon dioxide molecules. When people burn fossil fuels, if they burn coal, if they burn petroleum or natural gas, the carbon molecules that are trapped in these organic chemicals are released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So for example, this is the breakdown of methane. When you burn natural gas or methane, it's a reaction involving oxygen. You create water vapor and also carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide will rise up into the atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect. So the more fossil fuels we burn, the more carbon is moved from these fossil fuels where they were previously trapped to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. And this also goes for other gases as well. If there's a methane leak, a natural gas leak, and natural gas actually drifts up into the atmosphere, that's even worse for the greenhouse effect than carbon dioxide is. Also, CFCs and other types of refrigerant chemicals that people use in their fridges to cool stuff down, those chemicals also released into the atmosphere act as greenhouse gases. So the more of these greenhouse gases there are in the atmosphere, the stronger this greenhouse effect is, the more of a tendency there is to trap infrared light against the Earth, increasing global temperatures. And this is what's been going on. So ever since the Industrial Revolution, the average temperature of the Earth has been increasing, and this has been correlated with the rise in CO2 atmospheric concentration. So in this graph here, the black line is CO2 concentration. So as you can see, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has been increasing steadily since the 1880s, 1890s. And along with this, the temperature has gotten warmer. So this is compared to an average temperature. This might be taken in around the 1940s. You can see compared to this average, temperatures in the past used to be much colder than this average, and recent temperatures in the last few decades have been much hotter. In fact, the hottest years on record going back for more than 100 years have been, almost all of them have been in the last decade. So you could also ask, well, why is this a problem? Why is global warming something
that we as people should worry about. There's a few reasons why we should be worried about this. For one thing, global warming increases the likelihood of having kind of unpredictable weather patterns. Events like hurricanes require water to heat up, so that the more heat there is, the more likelihood you'll get these rare and unpredictable weather events. Global warming will also have a tendency to increase sea level because a lot of the water of the Earth is actually trapped in ice, in glaciers and icebergs. So as the temperature of the Earth goes up, this ice is going to melt and water is going to move from the ice into the oceans. So the overall sea level is going to go up, which will flood low-lying areas. In fact, the sea level could rise between 5 and 20 feet over the next 100 years. This is based on different modeling that scientists have done. If the ocean rose by 12 feet, then it would put these cities either completely or almost completely underwater. Miami, New Orleans, Norfolk, also many islands like the Maldive Islands, the Solomon Islands, would be completely underwater. A lot of the biggest cities in the world are close to the shore, like New York, New Orleans. A lot of these cities would lose a lot of their land if the ocean rose up by 12 feet. Global warming would also dry up areas around the world that are used for growing crops. Most of the land that's used for agriculture today is predicted to become much drier, much hotter as a result of global warming, which would make it even more difficult to grow crops there. And as you remember from my analysis of agriculture before, agriculture already is having trouble. It already is not sustainable the way it is. Okay. So now let's turn to another topic, which is extinctions. So one thing that I've mentioned before in lecture is that we are currently experiencing a rise in extinction rate around the world. So as humans have spread across the world and converted what you could call natural land to land useful to humans, primarily agricultural land, a lot of different habitats have disappeared, taking with them the species that require those habitats. So this habitat destruction has resulted in an increased extinction rate, possibly thousands of times the normal background extinction rate. It's predicted that human activity could result in the extinction of 30% of all vertebrate species in the next 50 years. So that includes, fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. About 30% of those species could go extinct because of our activities. Here are some species that we have driven to extinction just in the last 10 years. So these are species that 10 years ago were alive. We have pictures of them, but now these species are all extinct. So there have been a lot of extinctions already, but you could ask the question, why should we care about this? Why should we care about organisms going extinct? And I think there's two different pretty good reasons why people should care about this. The first reason is more subjective, and it's not something you could easily convince people of, but you could care about these organisms going extinct because you subjectively like having them around. You value their existence. Like, there are whales in the world, and if whales went extinct, even if that didn't affect us in terms of our economy or our livelihood, for some people that would just have an impact that, people would just feel sad that we went from a planet that had whales to one that didn't have whales. So you subjectively just enjoy the fact that there's this diversity. So that's a good reason, but not everyone would have that reason. The second reason is more based on our own self-interest. Like I talked about in ecology, the ecology lecture, there's a lot of complex links between organisms in a community. And if you cause an extinction, this can cause a chain reaction, which could eventually damage resources we depend upon. Like a lot of species that are in danger of going extinct are large predators, which in their communities would serve the role as a keystone predator and regulate the population of herbivores. So if those predators go extinct, it could cause a collapse of, vegetation or other species down the food web. So now let's shift topics to human population. And as a biologist, I always like to think of our impact of the world as a function of population size, because it's really true. How much we impact the world, how many resources we use, how much waste we produce, all of that is a function of our population size. So let's look at how population has changed over time. So humans have been living as humans for at least 200,000 years, probably more than 300,000 years. You could probably even go back in time, 800,000 or a million years and successfully interbreed with, an ancestral human from that time period. But let's be, a little bit conservative and say 200,000 years. So from 200,000 years ago up until about 12,000 years, the world human population was very low. It kind of increased very gradually, but it stabilized in the ballpark somewhere between 3 and 10 million people. And keep in mind that, at 12,000 years ago, people had already dispersed over most of the world, living in Australia and the Americas and Europe and Asia and pretty much everywhere that you'd find humans today. So the world was fully occupied by humans, 20,000 years ago, but the population was much lower than it is today. So you might be wondering, what allowed the population to be low and relatively stable for, upwards of 200,000 years or more? And there's a misconception in popular culture that this was because people's lives were just terrible and they were starving all the time and their, lifespans were so low that they just, they couldn't maintain a high population. And this is actually not true. Like if you research this, if you research what we know about indigenous communities and mechanisms of population control, what you find is that traditional societies around the world had traditional methods of regulating their population, of reducing their birth rate. So traditional methods of birth control. One of the most widespread mechanisms that reduces fertility is to extend breastfeeding. So if a woman breastfeeds, she's not completely incapable of having offspring, but her fertility is much reduced compared to if she's not breastfeeding. So you find with various groups around the world, the Burara people of Australia, Ake people of Paraguay, the Kung people of Africa, they breastfeed for 3, 4, 5 years within those societies. So this is referred to as prolonged lactation. And like I mentioned, it drastically reduces fertility. So the longer that women traditionally breastfeed within these groups, the more spaced out babies will tend to be, which reduces the overall birth rate. Another mechanism of birth control practiced among indigenous societies is to avoid sex after a new baby's born. And this can be taken to the extreme. So in the Grand Valley Dani people shown here of Indonesia, new mothers and fathers won't have sex with each other until 5 years have passed after a new birth. This is referred to as postpartum abstinence. But this is also found in other indigenous groups, like the Yoruba people of Nigeria, where it traditionally lasts about 3 years. So in this case, because the parents are not having sex with each other at all after a baby's born, that will really space out, from one child to the next. In some of these societies, it's presumed that, the people that are part of this couple may have other avenues of, sexual activity, but they do not have sex with each other in a way that would produce offspring. A lot of indigenous groups around the world have controlled their birth rate by medicinal contraception through naturally occurring plants. So for example, Native American women like the Ojibwe shown here on the left, they drank a tea made from a plant, the blue cohosh plant, that reduced their fertility. So herbal contraception can also act upon male fertility. Many societies throughout India and Southeast Asia traditionally have chewed papaya seeds to reduce male fertility. And this has been investigated by science. So in this study here that was performed, they compared sperm count, sperm motility, and then whether sperm had normal morphology or abnormal morphology for normal sperm compared to sperm that was treated with chemicals from papaya seeds. And they found that sperm count is reduced in exposure to those chemicals, sperm motility is reduced, and much more of the sperm has abnormal morphology and presumably would be much less capable of fertilizing eggs. Other plants used traditionally for contraception include Asiatic witchweed, parsley, fever root, stone seed, wild carrot, pennyroyal, and neem. So there's been whole books written about traditional herbs used to make concoctions that are effective as contraception. People all over the world also traditionally fashioned condoms out of different types of natural materials. In ancient China, they'd usually make condoms out of thin silk, as you see in this condom here to the left. In ancient Japan, they would make condoms out of leather or tortoise shell. Here's a rather hard, inflexible condom made out of tortoise shell in Japan. Or dyed linen in the case of ancient Egypt. In fact, here are some hieroglyphics showing putting a condom onto a man. And many groups all over the world fashion condoms out of animal intestines. So here's an example of an animal intestine condom. Animal intestines and bladders were also commonly used to hold water or inflated with air, that sort of thing. Some groups traditionally used the pull-out or withdrawal method of birth control, including the Maasai people, Ogu and Tonga peoples of Africa, ancient Romans, and various ancient Middle Eastern groups. Other groups, like in India, China, and the Nandi people of Africa, shown here in this picture on the right, they use the rhythm method, which is basically keeping track of a woman's menstrual cycle to figure out when she's least fertile, when there'd be the smallest chance of successful reproduction. In many indigenous groups, if earlier forms of birth control failed for whatever reason, and a woman actually became pregnant but she didn't want to be, unwanted pregnancies could be terminated through different methods of abortion. In some cases, this was accomplished through the consumption of certain herbs. You can see here, this is a medieval drawing from the 1200s showing the administration of an herbal solution which resulted in abortion. Australian Aborigines used many different traditional plants as effective abortion-causing agents, like, for example, the buttercup orchid. Abortion could also be accomplished through certain strong massages. So here's an ancient Hindu temple from Cambodia showing the use of massage-based abortion. So for a long time, the world population was relatively small, a few million individuals, but it really started to increase after the creation of intensive agriculture, which is sometimes referred to as the agricultural revolution around 10,000 BCE. This is a bit of a misnomer, though, because agriculture existed before then. This was just kind of like certain societies in the Middle East were extensively relying on agriculture and, increasing the yield of agriculture, which propelled their populations. And the population on Earth also increased very rapidly after the inventions associated with the Industrial Revolution of the 17 and 1800s. So you can see here is a graph of the human global population through time. You can see it kind of exploding pretty quickly after passing the 1800s. And here's a video version of this, so I think this is kind of a cool video. It shows pockets of 1 million people throughout history, and you can see when there's more people that are added in a certain area, it'll add another little circle. So we can see how the global population changed throughout historical times going up to, I think, around the year 2000. So take a look at this. This is a good kind of a visual representation of the last graph. And there are important events also that they highlight in the timeline. So let's take a look at this together. So I think that's a nice animation. So it's moving linearly through time, but you can really see the exponential rise in population over the last couple centuries. But something that I want to bring up, though, is that although the population was increasing throughout the last few thousand years, but most populations around the world were still small and stable. They were still following their traditional methods of birth control. But what happened is that these rapidly growing, oftentimes aggressive societies tended to push out smaller societies, trample them, or outright obliterate them so that the global population continued to rise. For example, in the Americas, about 90% of the indigenous population died off as a result of contact with European settlers. A lot of this was because of disease, because the indigenous population, those groups did remain at low density, and therefore they did not have a lot of protection against diseases that tend to show up in much more dense societies. But some of this wasn't just disease, it was also campaigns of destruction. Um, American governments, including governors, would put bounties on Native American people. So if you just killed Native Americans and brought in their scalps, you would get bounties for that. So nowadays in cities, people live at a much higher density compared to the way that hunter-gatherers lived, the way that we used to, tens of thousands of years ago. Like the density of a traditional hunter-gatherer group, and this was based on a study that I read that looked at hundreds of different indigenous peoples, is about 0.18 people per square kilometer. If you look at cities, city densities can be as high as 50,000 or 100,000 people per square kilometer. So this means we're living today in cities at about 400,000 times higher density than the conditions that we evolved under, that we spent most of human history and prehistory in. And as you increase population density, there's more pollution, more stress, and also a much greater transmission rate of diseases. Right now, there is approximately 7.8 billion people on Earth. And the reason why population is so important to studies of environmental impact is because the impact of a single individual gets multiplied 7.8 billion times across the globe. So how much food an individual eats, how much water they drink, how much waste they produce, how much energy they require, how much electricity they use, how much soil is necessary to feed them, all of this gets multiplied by 7.8 billion. So really, population is at the heart of looking at the impact we have on our environment. Yeah, so this is why many scientists, including myself, believe that our really large population size is at the heart of our impact on the world and something that we have to understand and address if we are going to be successful in solving our problems. We can learn a lot by looking at prehistory and history, because countless times in the past, human populations have collapsed, usually because of local environmental damage, especially soil degradation. So for example, the Mayans used to have a really high population size. They were at 15 million and they dropped, pretty rapidly to 1.5 million people. And this was because of extensive soil erosion, which decreased their food production capabilities. So they had widespread starvation. A similar thing happened to the Roman Empire. On the left here, you can see the population size of the Roman Empire through time, and there was a pretty severe crash around 500 AD. And there were different reasons for this. There were political reasons, there were military reasons, but there was also environmental reasons. The Roman Empire had degraded their soil, and they were not capable of producing enough food to feed everyone. The Black Death in Europe killed off between 30 to 60% of Europe's population in the 1300s. It varied 30 to 60% depending upon which country you're in. So some countries were hit harder than others. This is showing you the population of medieval England, which dropped from about 5 million down to about 2 million. Many ancient civilizations, like the Indus Valley civilization, the Hittites, the Akkadians, they collapsed primarily due to unsustainable agriculture. They exhausted their local freshwater supplies, they degraded their soil, and food productivity drastically decreased. The same problems that we're facing today. So human groups, like our strategist species, have sometimes overshot their carrying capacity, used up their local resources, and then experienced a population collapse. These are more characteristics of an R strategist than a typical K strategist, but although many human groups do behave like K strategists, staying stable around a carrying capacity, some of them don't. Some of them end up, shooting way high and drastically overshooting the ability of the local environment to support them. So I want to be very clear about this. The fact that we have 7.8 billion people alive today on our planet doesn't mean that our carrying capacity of Earth is 7.8 billion people or above that. The fact that our use of resources, and you could go through any resources, even ones I didn't talk about, energy, food, water, soil, wood, any of these resources, we're using them at an incredibly unsustainable rate. We're using up these resources way faster than they replenish. So that means that the Earth is not really supporting 7.8 billion people over the long term. The logical conclusion from this is that we've actually overshot the true long-term carrying capacity of our planet. If we don't manage to decrease our population in the future intentionally by planning, then our population will decrease in an unplanned fashion. We will face a future global population collapse. But there's some good news here. Like, the world's population is not something that is out of our control. What happens with the population, whether it grows, it shrinks, or remains stable, entirely depends upon the beliefs and behavior of people. So for example, there's this simulation, and I don't think I can run it right now within this YouTube video, but I included a link of this in the PDF. So I want you to check this out on your own. This is a really nice simulation where you can plug in different values for birth rate, number of offspring, lifespan, all of that. So a very simple simulation that I would like you guys to do if you have the chance. Go to this website and keep everything else the same. But the only thing is change it to the average number of child per couple is 1 child or 0 children. And then see what happens. And you'll see that what people do, how many children they have, will drastically change the future of the world, the future of our population. If everyone decides, the world is too crowded, it can't support us, let's all have 1 child per couple. If on average we have 1 child per couple, some people have 0, some people have 2. If on average we have 1 child per couple, the population will go down. It will go down. It'll take a while for it to start to decrease at an appreciable rate, but it will go down. It'll go down to a level that would be sustainable. So you don't need to have, higher mortality. You don't need to have any, severe consequences. If people just change their minds and change their behavior, that would cause the population to go down. And here you can see in this map, this is mapping birth rate across the world. You can see there's a lot of differences in birth rate. So let's look at what works, like what we know can be helpful in reducing birth rate. So before I talk about the point of these maps, let's just look at these 2 maps individually. The map on the left here is a map of the states in the United States where when sex education is provided, it only covers abstinence. There's no, state mandated covering of contraception use. So all of these states that are in red are states where they basically have abstinence only education. Now let's take a look at the map here on the right. So this is a map of teen pregnancy rates. The states that are in red have the highest teen pregnancy rate. States that are in pink are second highest, and the states that are kind of whitish have very low levels of pregnancy among teens. But I think you can see it's not a coincidence, but many of these states, particularly most of the South, but also like Montana, for example, a lot of the states that have only abstinence education tend to be the states that have really high pregnancy rates. So something that you can do to decrease birth rate is just to educate people about contraception. That by itself causes a decrease in birth rate. So we know a lot of mechanisms at work, educating women, giving them more power within a society, educating about contraception, allowing free contraception. There's evidence for all of these that doing those processes will tend to decrease birth rates. All right, so this is the discussion for this lecture, and I'll post an online assignment to go along with this. The first question for this is, what do you think is the most serious environmental problem facing us today? I covered a lot, so I just want you to think about it and give your honest opinion. For question 2, I want you to think for yourself, what do you think is the long-term global carrying capacity for humans? So kind of keeping in mind my discussion of carrying capacity, what we learned about carrying capacity before for population ecology. Give me an estimate for this number. And number 3, do you think it's possible for us to live on this planet in a sustainable way, given that we're not doing that right now? How could we do it? What would be a good plan? All right, so those are the questions to think about, and there's a couple more lectures left in the semester. I'll post them soon.